Jon Snow stood atop the battlements of Winterfell, his breath clouding the air as the chill wind nipped at his cheeks. The sky was overcast, a sheet of steel gray that reflected the subdued gloom of the north. Snow clung to the stone of the fortress, and he thought of how everything was about to change. He was young, barely a boy grown, yet his mind carried the weight of unspoken questions and an unrelenting curiosity. Here in the ancient seat of House Stark, time seemed measured by the turn of the seasons and the hush of secrets that lingered in dark corners. Even before the approach of King Robert's grand procession, still some weeks off, the keep was lively with preparations. Carts rolled in with extra provisions, storehouses bustled with activity, and stable hands tended to a growing herd of horses. But none of that busyness could explain the old stories that pulled at Jon's thoughts like unseen strings. Tales told in hushed voices of the crypts beneath Winterfell, of hidden relics, and of ghosts from ages past. Jon clutched the thick fur of his cloak around his shoulders, trying to ward off the biting wind. He looked down into the courtyard below, seeing men in stark livery going about their duties. Robb would be in the training yard, almost certainly sparring with Theon or mastering a new maneuver with their father's master-at-arms. Arya might be off somewhere practicing archery in secret or stealing pastries from the kitchens. Sansa would be indoors, attending needlework or reading about court etiquette in preparation for the king's arrival. Bran would be climbing the walls, defying every warning. And Rickon was still too young for any mischief. They all had places to be, roles to fulfill. Jon had his own duties as well, but as the bastard of Winterfell, he sometimes felt as if he existed on the edge of every group, the cusp of every conversation. He lived in the in-between, yearning to prove himself, to find something that was truly his own. That night, long after the sun had set and Winterfell was cloaked in the hush of deep darkness, Jon found himself wandering the corridors without much aim. His feet led him to the entrance of the Stark crypts. It was a place both revered and feared. He knew of the Stone Kings with iron swords on their laps and direwolf statues at their feet, of the echoing corridors that seemed to stretch on and on, filled with the quiet vigil of generations. He would not have gone there at night under any normal circumstances, but an old tale had gripped his mind for days, a half-forgotten story overheard from one of the traveling bards who sometimes visited. The tale spoke of an object of old Valyria hidden away in the north centuries ago. It made no sense, yet somehow it captured Jon's imagination like a song, compelling him to seek it out. Curiosity inched him deeper and deeper into the crypts, past the statues of lords long dead. Shadows cast by his flickering torch danced over ancient faces hewn from stone. Each lord of Winterfell seemed to stare at him from empty eyes, as though judging his trespass. The deeper he went, the colder it felt, until the chill seemed to come from within the very walls. He might have turned back had he not felt, deep in his core, a certain pull, an intangible sense that something was waiting for him. His ears caught the faint echo of dripping water and the scurry of distant rats. Then, in a small alcove behind a crumbling statue, he found a hole in the wall that led into an older, hidden chamber. He had never ventured there before. By the dim glow of torchlight, he squeezed through, scraping his shoulders against the rough stone. The chamber within was cramped and full of stale air. Dust covered every surface, stirred into ghostly motes by his intrusion. Jon held his torch high, coughing at the sudden swirl of ancient grime. At first, he saw only old bones, scattered and broken, perhaps the remains of an animal that had wandered in centuries ago. Then his eyes caught a glint of something in the far corner. Heart thudding in his chest, he stepped carefully over the bones and stooped to pick up the object. The torchlight revealed a smooth, stone-like surface with faint scales etched into it. It was larger than a man's head and heavy in his hands. He had heard stories of dragon eggs. They were said to be beautiful, shimmering things, sometimes described as black as onyx, sometimes the color of jade, or as dark green flecked with gold. This one looked different from the descriptions he had heard. The shell was the color of soot and ash, and the faint pattern of scales seemed nearly lost beneath a film of centuries-old dust. But every rumor he had ever heard told him that a dragon egg was unmistakable. Jon's heart raced. He could barely believe what he was holding. An impossible relic, here in Winterfell's hidden crypt. He remembered old Nan's tales of dragons and Targaryen kings, how the beasts once soared over Westeros before the doom of their line. He recalled half-whispered rumors that some eggs still existed in the world, hoarded by collectors or hidden away. The notion that one might lie forgotten beneath the stones of Winterfell defied logic. Yet here it was undeniable in its weight. Gazing at it, he wondered how it could still exist, and why no one had discovered it. If it truly was a dragon egg, it should have been lost or turned to stone, entirely petrified and beyond revival. Yet, as he brushed his fingertips across its surface, he thought he felt a faint warmth, so slight he nearly convinced himself he'd imagined it. He wrapped the egg in a thick cloth to conceal it and carried it gently up through the crypts, checking over his shoulder for any sign of watchers. The corridors of Winterfell were silent at that hour, the only movement the dancing shadows of his own torch. Once in his small room, Jon placed the egg carefully on his simple wooden table and stared at it. Ghost, his white direwolf, gave the thing a wary sniff, then turned away as if uneasy. Jon studied the egg's dull surface for a long time, spinning a tapestry of possibilities in his mind. Then, exhausted from the day's tasks and the weight of this discovery, he dozed off, leaving the torch to sputter in its sconce. The dawn came too soon, chasing away the night's wonder. Jon awoke stiff and anxious, the egg still on the table. He worried about what to do with it. Should he tell someone? Lord Eddard Stark was an honorable man, but there was no telling how he would react if he discovered a dragon egg in his keep. Might he summon Maester Luwin to study it, or would he have it destroyed for fear of Targaryen associations? The realm remembered the rebellion too well, and the memory of Dragonfire was still something feared. And Robert Baratheon, soon to arrive, would have no love for anything that might hint at a Targaryen resurgence. The boy who wore the name Snow but carried the blood of a Stark bastard couldn't know the far-reaching consequences of such a find. But something in Jon's heart told him that this was his destiny. This impossible egg was something meant for him alone. That day, Jon moved through his regular chores in a haze. He trained in the yard, sparred with Robb, tried to keep up with Theon's banter, and avoided the sharp eyes of their father. Winterfell bustled as always, but everything felt different. The secret weighed on him so heavily that he was sure it showed on his face. In quiet moments, he replayed the discovery again and again, wondering if it had been an odd dream. But each time he returned to his room, he saw the egg wrapped in cloth, hidden in a locked chest beneath his bed. It was the only place he could think to keep it safe. Ghost often lay by the bed, ears twitching, as though disturbed by some presence emanating from within. Days passed. The weather grew colder, the sky more leaden, and rumors of the king's impending visit crept through Winterfell like a rising tide. But Jon's focus was entirely on the dragon egg. Every night, when darkness shrouded the keep, he took it out and examined it by candlelight. He whispered to it, though he felt foolish, telling it the stories he had heard of dragons. He even dared to hold it over the small brazier in his room, seeking any sign of change in its petrified shell. He felt certain that it was more than just a fossil or a piece of stone. Some nights, Ghost would watch intently, his red eyes reflecting the fire's glow, as though he, too, sensed a flicker of life in that ancient shell. One late evening, a stranger arrived at Winterfell's gates. Jon was in the courtyard when the man appeared, clad in dark red robes trimmed with black, his hood pulled low over his features. The guards met him with suspicion, for the rarely traveled roads to Winterfell had grown treacherous. He gave his name as Torum, a priest of the Lord of Light. The man had come from the south, he claimed, on a pilgrimage that stretched from Volantis through the Free Cities and eventually to Westeros. Unusual as his presence was, Lord Eddard Stark extended the courtesy of hospitality. The North still adhered to the old gods, but no traveler in need was turned away, especially not one who spoke politely and carried no threat. That night, Torum dined at the Great Hall, among the rest of the household. Jon watched him from a distance, noticing the way his eyes gleamed in the firelight, flicking around the hall as though searching for something. The red robes, the mild accent, the faint smell of strange incense that clung to his person. Everything about Torum was foreign. Jon sensed an air of quiet intensity around the priest. He rarely smiled, though his demeanor remained courteous. He remarked on the cold, the grandeur of the hall, and occasionally asked questions about the region. Yet there was a subtle curiosity in his gaze whenever he caught sight of Jon, as if the boy carried a particular interest. Jon tried to dismiss it. He was used to being on the periphery of social gatherings, half acknowledged in conversation. But the weight of Torum's glance felt different. It struck him as unervingly direct, filled with an awareness beyond casual observation. That night, as Jon was leaving the hall, Torum approached him quietly. The torches in the corridor cast wavering shadows on the stone walls. The red-robed priest inclined his head in greeting, and Jon gave a courteous nod. Torum's voice was soft, with a lyrical accent that betrayed his origins far from the north. "Forgive my intrusion, young Snow," he said. "I could not help but notice your curiosity throughout the evening. You look at me as though you sense something new." Jon wondered how the man knew his name, but everyone in Winterfell knew of Jon Snow, the bastard. "We rarely see priests of your faith this far north," Jon replied guardedly. "I was only curious. My apologies if I offended." Torum studied Jon for a moment, then gave a slight smile that didn't touch his eyes. "No offense taken. Sometimes I travel where others do not, for my tasks lead me to many corners of the world." Jon nodded politely, feeling the conversation was coming to an end, and was about to excuse himself when the priest lowered his voice and added, "I seek the hidden truths of this land, young Snow, and in my searching, I sometimes sense that others, too, are looking for truths they cannot name. Are you one such searcher?" Jon tensed. Part of him wanted to deny it, to say he didn't know what Torum was talking about. But the question sparked something within him, something tied to the egg locked away in his chamber. He offered a careful reply. "I don't know what you mean." Torum tipped his head, regarding Jon thoughtfully. "If ever you wish to speak of deeper things, things of flame and prophecy, my door is open," he said, nodding toward the guest quarters. With that, he slipped away, leaving Jon with a swirl of half-formed questions and a faint feeling of unease. In the days that followed, Jon did his best to avoid the priest. He had enough concerns of his own without adding strange philosophies to the mix. Yet Torum was never far, often standing at the edges of gatherings or quietly observing from a vantage point. He asked gentle, probing questions of the household members, gleaning scraps of lore about Winterfell and its mysteries. The reticent northerners shared little, but Torum persisted with polite interest. Sometimes, Jon caught the priest glancing in his direction, a cryptic expression on his face. When a fierce snowstorm swept across Winterfell late one afternoon, Torum used the weather as a reason to extend his stay. He claimed the roads would be impassable until the snows eased. Lord Eddard, always honorable, consented. It was no hardship for a single guest, though some wondered why a priest of the Lord of Light had ventured this far from the southern temples or the free cities at all. Jon was among those who doubted the man's story, but said nothing, mindful of his own secret. That night, something stirred Jon from a restless sleep. Ghost stood on all fours, hackles raised, staring at the chest where the dragon egg lay hidden. The faint glow of the moon filtered through the narrow window, illuminating the direwolf's white fur. In that spectral light, Jon thought he saw a flicker under the lid of the chest, a shadow or reflection, as though the egg itself gave off a faint shimmer. Jon sat up, heart pounding. The chest was locked. He had the key around his neck, but still he moved quickly, fumbling to light a small lamp with flint and tinder. After unlocking the chest, he lifted the egg out. It felt slightly warmer than before, as if absorbing the heat from his hands. He ran his thumb over the shell, noticing how the etched scales seemed more pronounced. Ghost snarled softly, pacing around Jon in a circle. The direwolf's red eyes were fixed on the egg, ears flattened in apprehension. Jon tried to soothe him with gentle words, though he himself felt a mixture of awe and dread. He thought again of the old songs about dragons hatching when certain signs aligned: fire and blood, the presence of magic or prophecy. He was no king's son, no rightful heir to the Targaryen name. He was Jon Snow, a bastard from the north. Yet here he was, cradling what seemed to be a living dragon egg. A soft knock startled him. He froze, pressing the egg to his chest, heart racing. The hour was late. Who could possibly be outside his door? Another knock. Jon hurriedly set the egg back into the chest and locked it, then blew out the lamp. In the darkness, he opened the door just a crack. A faint orange glow spilled into the room, and there stood Torum, a hooded lantern in hand. The priest's eyes glimmered with an uncanny light. He spoke in a hushed tone. "Forgive me. The hour is late, but I felt a stirring. May I speak with you?" Jon's mind raced. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him, though he was certain Torum knew exactly why he was there. "What are you doing here?" he whispered sharply. Torum's voice was calm. "I come because there is something in these halls that calls to my faith. Your father's men would not understand, nor would they be so forgiving of questions regarding certain relics. But you have the scent of secrets about you, Jon Snow. I see it in your eyes. The Lord of Light has given me dreams, whispers, that speak of a hidden egg, an old egg far from the lands of its birth. I felt the warmth of its presence the moment I arrived." Jon's heart pounded so loudly he thought the priest must hear it. He wanted to deny everything, but Torum's expression told him that would be pointless. There was a look of certainty in the priest's eyes. "You must be mistaken," Jon stammered. Torum raised his lantern, casting dancing shadows on the stone wall. "I do not force knowledge upon any man," he murmured. "But the truth cannot be hidden forever. If it is what I suspect, you are in grave danger. The king will soon be here, and you know how he would respond to the mere rumor of a dragon's egg in Stark possession. Let me help you, Jon Snow." 1,000 doubts warred in Jon's head. He pictured King Robert's face, hearing the man's hearty laugh that so often turned to anger when talk of Targaryens arose. He recalled Ned Stark's stern sense of honor and how the truth, if revealed, could condemn them all. If the egg was discovered, the wrath of the Iron Throne could be swift and brutal. Torn by indecision, Jon thought of the flicker he had seen in the egg's shell, the subtle warmth. He whispered, "You're certain it's a dragon's egg? Not just stone?" Torum lowered his voice. "Oh, it is more than stone. I have studied many relics. This one is old, from the line that existed before the doom of Valyria, I suspect. I can't say whether it can hatch, but I have heard prophecies. Fire made flesh once more, rising in the north. An unlikely place for such a resurrection, don't you think?" Jon opened the door to his room and slipped inside, gesturing for Torum to follow. The priest entered with measured steps. Jon moved quickly to the chest, knelt, and fitted the key into the lock. He paused, letting out a shaky breath. "Swear you won't harm it," he said. "Swear it on your god." Torum bowed solemnly. "I swear on the Lord of Light. I mean it no harm." He knelt by Jon, the lantern illuminating the chipped wood of the chest. Jon opened the lid and gently removed the egg. In the lantern's glow, the shell revealed layers of subtle coloration. The black was threaded with faint red veins, as though smoldering embers were hidden just beneath the surface. Torum's eyes widened, and Jon saw reverence there. The priest reached out tentatively, but stopped short, seeking Jon's permission. Jon nodded, albeit with a wary tension in his jaw. Torum placed a hand on the egg, closing his eyes. For a long moment, he was silent, and Jon felt a faint warmth radiating from the shell. Then Torum withdrew his hand and exhaled softly. "It lives," he whispered, voice tinged with awe. "I sense a spark within, like a hearth buried under ashes. This egg has potential, can be awakened." Jon cradled the egg protectively, as though it were a newborn infant. "How?" he asked. "I've read a little. Dragon eggs can lie dormant for centuries. They need fire to hatch, but even that might not be enough." Torum nodded. "Ordinary fire will not suffice. The Lord of Light's flame is no simple blaze of wood and oil. It is touched by magic and prophecy. In Volantis, at the temple, there are rites practiced by the Red Priests, meant to call forth the powers of heat and life. If you truly want this creature to be born, it may require risking everything. The question is, do you have the will to see it through? Jon's heart pounded. He felt the weight of history pressing down on him, the knowledge that kings and conquerors once commanded the power of dragons. Could a bastard of the North truly take on that mantle? And what would it mean for Winterfell, for his brothers and sisters, for his father? He didn't know, but part of him had already decided. It was as if the egg had chosen him, and giving it up now felt unimaginable. Torum rose, a solemn look on his face. I must return to Volantis. My superiors await me there, and I have reason to believe they have foreseen a dragon reborn. If you come with me, we can hide the egg from those who would destroy it. We can nurture it in the cradle of the Lord of Light's favor. Jon stood, nearly trembling with the enormity of the offer. Leave Winterfell? Abandon the only home he had ever known? The only family? The thought terrified him. Yet his future here was uncertain at best. Once Robert arrived, Jon would be overshadowed by official festivities, overshadowed by trueborn heirs. He was still just the bastard. Even if the egg's existence was never discovered, he would remain an outsider. But traveling with this priest to a land he knew only through rumor was a dire risk. I can't decide this now, he breathed. The king will be here in days. My father, Lord Stark, he might not let me leave. Torum regarded him with understanding. All is in the hands of R'hllor. But consider this, Jon Snow. Once the king arrives, your choice may be taken from you. If Robert Baratheon learns of this egg, there will be no mercy. And if your father learns of it, his honor may compel him to hand it over for destruction. The safest course is to hide the egg far away. And if you wish for it to hatch, only fire and faith can coax a living dragon from centuries of slumber. Jon stared down at the egg, silent. The priest quietly slipped away, leaving Jon alone with the most monumental decision of his life. The days leading up to King Robert's visit were tense, overshadowed by the knowledge of what Jon had locked in his chest. Preparations in the castle ramped up. Extra rooms were aired out, casks of ale were rolled from the cellars, and the household bustled with excitement. The Stark children chattered about the grand procession, the tournaments, and the feasts. Jon felt like a ghost drifting among them, weighed down by secrets. Torum remained a peripheral presence, always polite, always waiting, as if measuring the right moment. On the morning the king was due to arrive, riders came in, announcing that the royal procession was still a day's journey away. Everyone knew Robert Baratheon traveled with all the pomp of a triumphant conqueror. Knights, lords, ladies, and a host of bannermen. By midday, rumors of a certain pace suggested the king might arrive even earlier if he pushed his retinue. Jon paced in his small room, heart thrumming with indecision. He had told no one but Ghost, and that wise beast offered only silent companionship. Before evening, Jon gathered his belongings. He didn't own much. A few changes of clothes, a spare cloak, a small pouch of coin that he had saved through the years, a small wooden figurine of a direwolf that Robb had once carved for him. He wrapped the dragon egg carefully, cushioning it in spare linens, and placed it in a bag he kept close to his body. Then, swallowing hard, he walked to the courtyard, where Torum was waiting with 2 horses. The priest looked at him with solemn acceptance, as though he'd never truly doubted Jon's choice. Wordlessly, they mounted and slipped out of Winterfell under the cover of dusk, quietly enough that only a few guards on the gate saw them leave. Jon thought he recognized a flicker of confusion in their faces. They must have assumed the priest had Lord Stark's permission. But no one dared to stop them. The gates opened, and Jon Snow passed beyond the ancient walls of Winterfell into a future uncertain and unimaginable. They rode hard through the night, the northern roads bleak and lonely. The wind whipped at Jon's face, and each clop of the horses' hooves felt like a step further from everything he had ever known. Ghost loped alongside them, silent as a white shadow, occasionally pausing to sniff the air. Torum spoke little, focusing on finding the right path south. Their journey would be long, and each day meant they risked crossing paths with all manner of threats. Bandits, wildlings come over the border, or roving beasts. But Torum assured him that if they moved quickly, they could reach the eastern coastline in a fortnight, where a hired ship would carry them across the narrow sea to the free cities, then ultimately to Volantis. Jon's thoughts spun with questions about the future. He pictured his siblings' reactions when they discovered he was gone. Would they think he had run away out of shame or envy? Would his father guess at something more? And the king? If Robert arrived to find the bastard son missing, would he be suspicious? Jon tried to steel himself to cling to the belief that what he was doing was right, that he was safeguarding a relic that might reshape history, or at least shape his own destiny. The eggs seemed to radiate warmth even through the wrappings. He prayed no one would stop them or search their bags, because if discovered, the consequences would be dire. The journey south was grueling, but Torum seemed indefatigable, pressing them onward at a quick pace. Jon's body ached from days in the saddle, and Ghost trotted faithfully at their side, pausing only to hunt small game when hunger demanded it. They slept in hidden groves and out-of-the-way shelters, always mindful of watchers. Jon was no stranger to traveling within the north, but never had he ventured so far with so much at stake. He found himself confiding in the priest, asking about Volantis, about the Red Temple, and about the religion of R'hllor. Torum spoke with measured passion, describing a grand temple of black and red stone, lit by thousands of flickering flames. He told of the high priest who oversaw ceremonies that invoked the Lord of Light's blessings. The largest city in the known world, he called Volantis, teeming with life and caravans from every corner of Essos. Jon could scarcely imagine a place so vast and so unlike the quiet fortress of Winterfell. Every evening, once they made camp, Jon would take the egg from his bag and hold it near the fire. Ghost watched, still uneasy. The dire wolf growled softly whenever the flames licked too close. Torum would hum a low chant, words in a language Jon did not know, as though coaxing the egg to wake. After a week, Jon noticed distinct changes in the shell. The black had become deeper, the faint red veins more vibrant. When he placed his ear against its surface at night, he thought he heard soft stirring, like the heartbeat of a creature in slumber. Torum's eyes gleamed with excitement at these small signs of life. "The Lord of Light guides us," he would say. "Keep it warm, Jon Snow, and keep your faith. It will soon hunger for the great fires of the temple." Jon couldn't help feeling a thrill of anticipation, mixed with dread of the unknown. Here he was, carrying a living dragon, away from the only land he had known, heading for a city he had never seen. All the while, he wrestled with guilt over leaving his family with no explanation. Yet, each day, he felt more certain that the egg was meant for him, as if some ancient bond was forming. They made their way east, crossing into mountainous terrain that tested their endurance. Jon learned that Torum was no ordinary pilgrim. He had uncanny survival skills, knowledge of shortcuts and rarely used passes, and a sense for impending danger. Twice they encountered small bands of raiders, but Torum steered them clear with ease, as though guided by an unseen hand. A hush fell over them in those tense moments, Ghost's hackles raising, but each time they evaded confrontation. At last they glimpsed the sea. Standing on a rugged cliff, Jon looked out at the churning waters of the narrow sea. The wind carried the scent of salt, a brine he was unaccustomed to. Torum pointed to a small port down below, where a handful of ships bobbed on the waves. "We'll find passage there," he said. "A friend of the faith awaits, one who can carry us across to Essos." Jon nodded, unable to tear his eyes from the expanse of water. He had read about the sea, heard Theon brag about voyages from the Iron Islands, but seeing it for the first time was staggering. The horizon seemed endless, the crash of waves an unceasing roar. Ghost paced at his heels, as though uncertain about this vast new domain. That night, they spent their last hours in Westeros, camped on the outskirts of the port town. Jon found his mind adrift, imagining what new wonders and horrors awaited on the other side of the sea. They boarded a small but sturdy vessel the next day, thanks to Torum's arrangements with a swarthy captain who wore a red scarf as a mark of some unspoken alliance. The voyage was cramped. The captain eyed Jon with mild curiosity, and eyed Ghost with outright caution, but said nothing after Torum offered some coin and a whispered promise. The ship set sail under a cloudy sky. Jon felt his stomach lurch as the deck rocked beneath his feet. Ghost slunk to a quiet corner, clearly disliking the motion. Jon gripped the egg in its wrappings, keeping it close to his chest whenever possible. He ventured on deck as much as the weather allowed, seeking fresh air. The roll of the sea was unending, and at times he felt ill. But the egg seemed content, warmed by the hold's limited brazier. Torum performed quiet prayers in a small corner of the ship, the flames of a lantern dancing across his features. Days passed at sea, and the weather took a violent turn. A storm battered the vessel, howling winds and massive swells that slammed the ship's hull. Water dripped through the ceiling of their small cabin. Lightning split the sky, momentarily revealing the fear in the sailors' eyes. Jon clutched the egg as thunder boomed overhead. The egg felt hot to the touch, as if responding to the chaos around it. In the flicker of lightning, Jon imagined he saw faint cracks appear across the surface, but it might have been his imagination. Torum assured him it was no accident they had faced such a trial, that the Lord of Light tested those chosen for destiny. Exhausted and seasick, Jon only nodded, longing for landfall. At last, they arrived in Essos, docking at a busy port swarming with merchants, laborers, and travelers from countless lands. The captain and crew seemed relieved to see them go, particularly the hulking direwolf, whose presence had unnerved many. Torum led Jon through the bustling streets with confidence, weaving past vendors hawking bright spices and exotic fruits, beggars clad in rags, and mercenaries in battered armor. Jon had never seen so many colors, heard so many tongues spoken at once. The air was hot and humid compared to the cold of the north, and the city felt alive with a chaotic pulse. They secured passage on a larger caravan heading southeast toward Volantis, crossing inland roads dotted with caravan towns, way stations, and ancient ruins. The vegetation changed as they traveled, the roads lined by tall grass, stunted trees bent by perpetual winds, and farmland that stretched for leagues. Everywhere, Jon saw the signs of a thriving trade network and glimpsed wonders he had never imagined. Tall columns from lost civilizations, monstrous statues half sunken in the earth, and wide rivers teeming with vessels of all sizes. Ghost adapted warily, keeping close to Jon and snarling at any who came too near. Torum's red robes drew stares, but few dared interfere, for the Red Temple's influence extended far in these lands. As they approached Volantis, Jon gazed upon the massive black walls in the distance. The city sprawled across both sides of the River Rhoyne, connected by the long bridge that bristled with shops and residences. The architecture was a testament to ancient Valyria, ornate, grand, and unsettling. The city exuded a sense of faded glory. Slaves with tattooed faces hurried about on errands for their masters. Priests in red robes chanted near shrines, and wealthy merchants rode in sedan chairs. The heat pressed down on them like a physical weight, and the stench of too many people living too close assaulted Jon's senses. It was a far cry from the clean crispness of the north. Yet Volantis also inspired awe. Torum led him across the long bridge, where stalls selling everything from weapons to fine silks lined the way. The crowds were thick, and Jon kept a hand on the egg, hidden in a satchel beneath his cloak. Ghost's presence helped keep pickpockets at bay. No one wanted to risk a direwolf's wrath. They wound through narrow streets until they reached the Red Temple, an imposing structure of black and red stone, topped by braziers that belched fire at all hours. Giant statues flanked the entrance, images of the Lord of Light, or so Torum claimed, carved in the style of ancient Valyria. Jon had never seen anything like it. Inside, the air shimmered with heat from countless flames. Rows of fire bowls lined the vast hall, their flickering light illuminating towering columns and walls adorned with tapestries of crimson and gold. The scent of incense was overwhelming. Red-robed priests and priestesses moved about with solemn grace, tending to worshippers who knelt on stone floors. Some chanted in unison, voices echoing beneath a cavernous ceiling. Torum led Jon into a more private chamber, away from the main worship halls. The room was cooler, its walls thick and windowless. A circular fire pit dominated the center, flames licking at the air. A robed figure waited for them, hooded, hands folded in front. The figure lowered the hood, revealing a lean face marked by the passage of time, sharp eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire. This was High Priest Rallio, one of the elder priests of the temple. Torum knelt respectfully, and Jon followed suit awkwardly. The High Priest's voice was a low rumble as he spoke to Torum in a foreign tongue, likely High Valyrian or some dialect. The exchange lasted a few moments, after which Torum turned to Jon. "Show him the egg," he said gently. Jon felt a flush of apprehension. This was a moment of no return. He reached into his satchel, pulling out the egg swaddled in cloth. Carefully, he removed the wrappings. The egg seemed to pulse with warmth, its shell darker and the crimson veins more pronounced. A hush fell in the chamber. The High Priest stepped forward with a measured dignity, placing his hands on either side of the egg. He closed his eyes, muttering incantations under his breath. Jon sensed a stirring in the air, a subtle shift in the temperature, as if the flames in the pit drew closer. When the High Priest opened his eyes, they glimmered with an intensity that made Jon's spine tingle. He spoke in heavily accented common tongue. "This is no dead stone, nor idle relic. It is alive. You have done well to bring it here, Jon Snow. We have awaited one who carries the blood of the dragon but was raised in the cold of the north. The Lord of Light's flames have whispered of such a child." He paused, studying Jon's face. "You have the look of the wolf, yet inside you burns another fire." Jon's heart pounded. He felt both exposed and oddly validated, as though this stranger saw secrets he himself barely understood. He cleared his throat, voice subdued. "I didn't know what else to do. In Westeros, it would have been destroyed." The High Priest nodded gravely. "Yes, the usurper and his line fear all that ties to House Targaryen. But fear not. Here we shall nurture this egg. And we shall nurture you, Jon Snow, for you are part of this prophecy." He turned to Torum. "Prepare the rites for hatching. The blood of dragons calls." Torum bowed. "Yes, High Priest." Thus began Jon's new life in Volantis. The temple provided him a small chamber, far more austere than the comfort of Winterfell, though it was warmer and smelled strongly of spice and incense. He was given simple robes to wear, for armor and furs were stifling in this climate. Every day he attended rituals, learning more about the faith of R'hllor. He practiced their prayers and chants, though with skepticism. Magic was not something the North taught in detail, yet he could not deny what he witnessed in those halls. Flames that danced in uncanny patterns, priests who seemed capable of glimpsing truths in the flicker of light, and an undeniable power thrumming in the air. Ghost remained close, often pacing the corridors warily. The Red Priests eyed the dire wolf with curiosity, some calling him an omen of the old gods, but none dared approach him without Jon's permission. The day came when they led Jon to a vast subterranean chamber beneath the temple, lit by a massive brazier that glowed white-hot. The walls were black stone, likely basalt, carved centuries ago. Torches ringed the room, and high above, an opening in the ceiling let in a single beam of daylight or moonlight, depending on the hour. High Priest Rallio and several other senior priests stood by the central brazier. Jon brought the egg, cradling it in his arms. He felt it pulsate, almost like a living heart. His chest tightened at the thought of what was to happen. They intended to lay the egg in the heart of the brazier's flames, stoke the fire with the power of their rituals, and attempt to coax the dragon within to break free of its shell. The ceremony would be dangerous, for no one could predict how the unhatched dragon would respond, or whether the egg might crack and release no living creature at all. The chanting began, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the chamber. Priests circled the brazier, arms raised, invoking the Lord of Light in a swirl of foreign words. Rallio turned to Jon, gesturing for him to place the egg in the flames. Jon hesitated, feeling the heat on his face, waves of scorching air searing his skin. He steeled himself and stepped forward. Slowly, he lowered the egg into the inferno. Even through the cloth that wrapped it, he felt the intense heat. The shell glowed, black turning to a molten hue, red veins blazing like magma. Jon withdrew his arms just in time, his own skin dangerously close to being burned. He watched, transfixed, as the flames roared higher. The chanting grew in volume, echoing off the walls. The heat was unimaginable, sweat streaming down Jon's face. His eyes stung, but he refused to look away. The priests' voices coalesced into a single resonant note, vibrating through the stone beneath his feet. The egg began to crack, lines spiderwebbing across its surface. A deafening silence fell, as though time had paused in anticipation. Then, with a sound like thunder, the shell split apart. A piercing cry echoed in the chamber, so alien it sent chills skittering along Jon's spine. Within the flames, something moved, a slender, serpentine shape shimmering with black and crimson scales. Gasps of awe and fear rose from the priests. Jon's breath caught in his throat. The shape uncurled, shaking free of the last fragments of shell. Two wings, wet and glistening, spread wide. A hatchling dragon, no larger than a cat, stumbled in the brazier's flames, which did not harm it in the slightest. The little creature opened a tiny maw and shrieked, belching a lick of flame that danced in the superheated air. With tremulous steps, it stumbled out of the brazier, smoke rolling off its dark hide. Jon felt a surreal wave of emotion, unable to believe what he was seeing. A living dragon. In that moment, he felt a connection deeper than words, as if an ancient bond had awakened. Somehow, the creature's eyes locked onto Jon's, reflecting the fire of the brazier. The dragon hissed softly and took a tentative step toward him. Rallio and Torum exchanged glances of elation and reverence. The chant shifted into prayers of thanksgiving. Jon dropped to one knee, extending a trembling hand. The heat radiating from the hatchling scales was intense, but it allowed him to come closer. He gently placed his palm against its side, feeling the vibration of a rapid heartbeat. The dragon sniffed at him, mouth parted in curiosity. Though small, it looked lethal, with needle-sharp teeth and claws. It emitted another soft hiss, but did not recoil. Jon felt an overwhelming surge of protectiveness, as though this tiny creature were part of him. "Behold," said Rallio, voice hushed in awe. A dragon hatchling brought forth in the halls of the Red Temple. The Lord of Light's blessing has awakened it. He turned to Jon. "And you, Jon Snow, you shall learn to guide this creature. You have the blood. Now you must embrace your true heritage." Jon barely heard the words. His heart thundered. The little dragon regarded him with an intelligence he hadn't expected. It was alive against all odds, and it had chosen him, or so it seemed. In the swirl of smoke and chanting, Jon felt tears threaten to blur his vision. He thought of Winterfell, of his father, of his brothers and sisters. Would they believe this if they saw it? Would they think him a threat or an abomination? And what of the realm across the sea, where King Robert's hatred of Targaryens burned bright? A living dragon changed everything. It was power incarnate. Yet it was small now, vulnerable, and it needed him. In the days that followed, the temple became a nexus of rumor. Whispers spread that a dragon had hatched in the secret chambers. Most common folk disbelieved or thought it a myth. Within the temple, the priests looked upon Jon with renewed reverence and caution. Some called him the Winter Dragon's father, while others whispered that he might be an embodiment of prophecy, the swirl of ice and fire. Jon tried to ignore the whispers and focus on caring for the hatchling, who seemed to cling to him, spitting small flames at anyone else who drew too close. They kept the creature in a special enclosure near a constant source of heat, feeding it a diet of raw meat. Each day, Jon would spend hours there, forging a bond that felt deeper with every passing moment. The dragon's scales hardened, becoming a lustrous mix of black and deep red. Its eyes burned a molten orange, reflecting every flicker of light. Ghost was wary, giving the hatchling a wide berth, but the two animals seemed to share a mutual respect. as if each recognized the other's fierce nature. There were times when Ghost would watch from a distance, head tilted, while the dragon hissed or chortled, a sound that might have been a babyish attempt at a roar. Torum guided Jon through a series of lessons. Some involved theology, reading passages from ancient texts about the bond between dragon and rider, the significance of fire, and cryptic allusions to a prince that was promised. Others were more practical, learning how to handle the dragon without losing a limb. Jon discovered that the creature recognized his voice and responded to certain tones and touches, almost as though it understood. He named it Shadowfire, for the smoky darkness of its scales and the flames it breathed. The name felt right, echoing the histories of Targaryen dragons while acknowledging the creature's unique nature. Yet not everyone in the temple welcomed this new power. Jon sensed envy in some priests, especially those who had spent years trying to gain visions in the flames but saw no sign of dragons. A few older priests muttered that the boy was unworthy, a bastard who might pollute the prophecy. Rumors circulated that House Targaryen was cursed, that all dragons were doomed by the doom of Valyria. High Priest Rallio, however, remained steadfast, proclaiming the event a blessing from the Lord of Light. He insisted that Jon's presence had been foretold in ancient scrolls, that a dragon would hatch under the auspices of fire and blood, far from its homeland. Jon also wrestled with his own doubts. He recalled the Stark motto, "Winter is coming," and the old gods of the north, the faces in the weirwood trees. Was he betraying his upbringing by embracing this foreign faith? He thought of Ned Stark's unwavering honor, of how he taught Jon to remain true to who he was. Yet, had he stayed in Winterfell, the egg would have been destroyed or left to petrify forever. At least here, it could thrive, and Jon had a chance to become something more than the shadow of a bastard. He carried a truth he couldn't fully articulate, that while the blood of House Stark ran in his veins, so did another lineage, a mysterious heritage that gave him a bond with this dragon. Perhaps it was madness, but he felt it as surely as he felt his own heartbeat. Time slipped by in a haze of rituals, dragon care, and intense study. The city of Volantis surrounded the temple like an endless labyrinth, but Jon only ventured out occasionally, accompanied by Torum. On one such outing, they walked the crowded streets, purchasing fresh meat for Shadowfire. Jon marveled at the variety of people. Tall men from the Summer Isles, pale-skinned riders from the Dothraki Sea, squat men from Lazer, all mingling in the chaotic markets. Torum insisted it was vital Jon learn of the world beyond the temple, that he understand the complexities of power in Essos. For a Targaryen, if indeed Jon truly counted as such, these alliances might one day matter. Jon wasn't sure he wanted any part in conquest or thrones, but the priest's words left him unsettled. Shadowfire grew quickly. Within weeks, it outgrew the small enclosure. Its wings stretched, the membranes transitioning from near translucent to a rich crimson. Sparks danced along its teeth when it hissed, and the fire it breathed intensified. Feeding the dragon became a spectacle. It would devour large portions of mutton or goat, belching smoke and curling up around Jon afterwards. Each time it curled its scaled body around him, Jon felt an odd warmth of companionship. Yet he also knew the day would come when Shadowfire would be too large, too fearsome, for mere enclosures. The braziers and temple fires would not be enough. One day the dragon would want to soar. Torum guided Jon through a series of fire rituals aimed at strengthening the bond. This included standing close to large flames while Shadowfire roared, facing the heat until Jon's skin felt singed. The idea was to test Jon's endurance, to see if his rumored Targaryen blood would shield him as the old stories claimed. He discovered that while he was not immune to fire, he had a remarkable tolerance for high temperatures. He still felt burns if he lingered too long, but more than once, the priests whispered that the flames licked at him gently, leaving him merely reddened instead of blistered. "He's not Daenerys," one priest muttered once, referencing the rumored last Targaryen princess across the sea, who was said to be impervious to flame when she birthed her own dragons. But High Priest Rallio dismissed such talk. "Each child of Valyria's line is touched differently," he insisted. "The gift comes in many forms. Jon's dreams changed during this time. He often dreamt of flying over vast icy landscapes, the dragon's roar echoing beneath an aurora of shifting lights in the northern skies. Other nights, he dreamt of standing in a hall of mirrors, where each reflection showed a different fate: a bastard in a black cloak, a king with a crown of swords, a dragon lord cloaked in flame. He woke from these dreams in a cold sweat, Shadowfire stirring restlessly by his bedside. One evening, Torum approached Jon in his chamber, wearing a grave expression. "The High Priest wishes to speak with you," he said. "It is a matter of your lineage." The mention of lineage made Jon's stomach tighten. He had long suspected there was more to his birth than Ned Stark admitted, but the man's honor seemed unbreakable. All Jon knew was that his mother was a mystery, rarely spoken of. Now, in the halls of Volantis, was he about to learn something more? He followed Torum to a quiet library alcove, walls lined with ancient tomes and scrolls. High Priest Rallio stood by a tall candelabra, reading from a scroll adorned with dragon sigils. He looked up at Jon's approach. "There are texts here that speak of Rhaegar Targaryen, Prince of Dragonstone," Rallio began, his voice solemn. "He was a man of prophecy, seeking the prince that was promised. Some believed his line would produce this savior. Others claim his line ended on the trident. But we have found references suggesting his child was spirited away, hidden in the north. You have the look of a Stark, but also the blood of the dragon. Your tolerance for fire is proof enough, but the hatching of Shadowfire seals it. Blood calls to blood." Jon felt the floor sway beneath him. He had heard rumors that Rhaegar Targaryen had fathered children with Elia Martell, all killed during the sack of King's Landing, and another rumored child with Lyanna Stark. Could that child be him? The idea stunned him. For years, he had wrestled with the question of his mother's identity, never suspecting it might be Ned Stark's own sister. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place. Ned Stark's unyielding honor, the secrecy around Jon's birth, the repeated suggestion that Lyanna was close to Rhaegar. Jon felt a tremor pass through him. Was he truly a Targaryen prince? Rallio's voice was gentle but insistent. "The Lord of Light has shown us that you are more than a bastard from the north. You are the living heir to a line of dragonlords. Shadowfire responds to you as it would only to its own blood. This means you have a claim, Jon Snow, a claim to the legacy of House Targaryen." Jon shook his head, reeling. I never wanted a claim. I'm just Jon. I grew up thinking I was Ned Stark's son, only with no name. I don't know anything about ruling or thrones." Torum placed a reassuring hand on Jon's shoulder. "We do not say this to burden you, but to guide you. Now that a dragon has hatched for you, others will seek that power. The Red Temple sees a destiny in you. Whether you embrace it is your choice, but the truth cannot be denied. If Robert Baratheon learns of your survival, he will not rest until you are destroyed." Jon's thoughts whirled. He pictured Winterfell's courtyard, the faces of Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon, the calm of the Godswood. Then he envisioned the Iron Throne, a seat made of twisted swords, once the seat of Targaryen power. Had his father lied to him all these years to protect him? The magnitude of it all was overwhelming. "My father, or the man I called father, must have had reasons," he murmured. "But if this is true, what am I supposed to do now? Am I to challenge King Robert? That sounds like madness. He commands the 7 kingdoms. I'm just one boy with a hatchling." Rallio closed the scroll gently. "Prophecies often speak of a long path. Some who walk it never see their grand destiny fulfilled. Yet I believe the Lord of Light guided you to us so that you may grow in power and wisdom. There is more at stake than a throne. Darkness gathers in the far north, does it not? A cold evil that even the free folk whisper about. The realm's petty quarrels may pale compared to what is coming." Jon swallowed. He recalled the old stories of the long night of White Walkers and something stirring beyond the wall. "You speak of the legends of the others," he said. "My father never confirmed them, but we all heard the tales." The High Priest's gaze was unwavering. "Dragons are the natural foe of the cold darkness. fire against ice. Perhaps that is the role you must play, Jon Snow, or should I say Jon Targaryen. Whether you call yourself a king is irrelevant. This realm will need dragons in the wars to come." Jon clenched his fists, feeling a strange mixture of fear and resolve. A memory surfaced. The stark words, "Winter is coming." He had always felt them as a warning, a shadow looming over the north. Now he held a living flame in the form of Shadowfire, a weapon that might stand against that looming threat. Could it be that was his true purpose, not to sit on a throne but to guard the realm from an ancient evil? In the weeks that followed, Jon continued his training with Shadowfire, forging a deeper connection and learning the rudiments of controlling a dragon's instincts. The priests prepared him for the possibility that one day he might fly upon the creature's back. They told him stories of dragon riders past, how the bond between man and dragon shaped history. But it would be a long time yet before Shadowfire was large enough to bear a rider. Meanwhile, Jon studied the prophecies, gleaning what wisdom he could from the Red Temple's archives. He learned about Azor Ahai, the hero who was said to forge a flaming sword to combat the darkness. Some believed the hero would be reborn in the Targaryen line. Others believed the prophecy was more fluid, applying to any who took on the mantle of fire to fight the cold. Jon wasn't sure if he believed in fate, but he couldn't dismiss the evidence in front of him. At times, he felt homesick. He missed the crisp air of Winterfell, the sense of belonging he had found among his siblings, even if he was a bastard. He wondered if Ned Stark lay awake at night, guilt-stricken over Jon's disappearance. He worried about Arya's wildness, about Sansa's innocence, about Robb's responsibilities as heir. Yet returning to Westeros seemed impossible now. The moment Robert Baratheon or the Lannisters discovered a living dragon, they would strike with all their might. Also, as the High Priest had warned, the seat of power in King's Landing would never permit a Targaryen heir to roam free. So Jon remained in Volantis, quietly growing, forging his identity anew. Shadowfire wasn't the only dragon rumored to exist. Jon overheard travelers speak of Daenerys Targaryen in the distant east, some saying she, too, had hatched dragons. Others dismissed such rumors as tavern talk. Jon found it eerie hearing about a woman who might be his bloodkin, hatching dragons around the same time. Could the fates truly align so neatly? If she existed, she might one day try to claim the throne in Westeros. Would that make them allies or rivals? The question lingered in Jon's thoughts. As Shadowfire entered another growth spurt, the temple set aside a larger courtyard within its walls for the dragon to roam. The creature's appetite grew voracious, and the heat it required became more intense. Priests carefully supervised, ensuring no inadvertent fires consumed the ancient building. Jon spent hours there, letting the dragon stretch its wings, occasionally testing short flight hops. The courtyard's walls kept Shadowfire contained, but Jon knew it was only a matter of time before the dragon could scale or fly over them. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. In quiet moments, Jon reflected on his future. The priests seemed to expect grand deeds from him, but he wasn't sure he wanted to become a conqueror. He only knew that winter was coming, and something told him his destiny lay back in Westeros eventually, not here in the warm lands. For now, though, he was still a boy with a half-grown dragon. The day would come when he would need to make a choice, whether to return and reveal himself or to stay in exile and let the realm face its threats without him. He made small attempts to stay informed about events across the sea. Merchants and travelers brought tidings of King Robert's court, of the Lannisters' growing influence, of tensions with the Iron Islands. Jon learned that Eddard Stark had traveled south with the king, that mysteries surrounded the death of Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King. News traveled slowly across the narrow sea, filtered through rumor and exaggeration. But every scrap of gossip pulled at Jon's heart, reminding him that, for better or worse, Westeros was his home. Even if the temple taught him to embrace the fire of his dragon heritage, he could not fully cast aside the wolf within him. On a balmy evening, after a rigorous session feeding and tending to Shadowfire, Jon sat in the courtyard by a low wall, Ghost sprawled at his side, the dragon curled up to soak in the last rays of the sun. Torum joined him, silent for a while, observing the improbable companionship between direwolf and dragon. Finally, the priest spoke. "You've come a long way from the boy who left Winterfell." Jon nodded thoughtfully. "Some days I barely recognize myself, but I can't deny that Shadowfire feels like a part of me. I never thought I'd be important or that I had a destiny." Torum offered a slight smile. "Destiny can be a heavy burden, but you have a kind heart, Jon. Don't let the weight of prophecy harden you. The realm needs leaders who do not seek power for power's sake." Jon ran a hand over Ghost's snowy fur. "I keep thinking about the north. Winter is coming, and with it, threats we might not fully comprehend. I have a dragon, but I don't have an army. Even if I returned, what could I do?" Torum placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "In time, Shadowfire will be as formidable as any war host. A single dragon can turn the tide of battles, shape the fate of nations. The question is, when you go back, what will you fight for? Revenge on those who usurped House Targaryen? Or to protect the realm against a greater evil?" Jon watched as Shadowfire flicked its tail, unleashing a tiny spurt of flame. The flicker illuminated the courtyard, dancing in the growing twilight. He thought of his father's face, stern and resolute, and of the motto passed down through the generations. He exhaled slowly. "I fight for the living," he murmured, echoing words he had once heard in a moment of clarity. "Whatever that means, I'll do what I must." Torum squeezed his shoulder in understanding. In the distance, the bells of Volantis tolled, marking the passing of another hour. The air was thick with the city's sounds. The clamor of merchants packing up stalls, the distant roar of riverside taverns, the cries of slaves bidden to their nighttime tasks. Within the temple walls, though, there was a sense of timelessness, as if ancient forces beyond mortal ken were at play. Jon closed his eyes, listening to the mingled breathing of Ghost and the dragon. He felt the layered tapestry of his identity. A wolf of the north, a dragon of Valyria, a bastard searching for purpose. Torn between worlds, yet bound to a destiny that glowed in the embers of prophecy. Days turned into weeks, then months. Shadowfire's growth continued, slowly but steadily. The priests taught Jon the rudiments of High Valyrian, so he could command the dragon in the old tongue of the Targaryens. He learned phrases like Dracarys, though the word's meaning felt too grim a reminder of the destructive power he now wielded. He also practiced combat under Torum's guidance, staff work, swordsmanship, and archery. He was no stranger to martial training from Winterfell, but here he honed those skills with fresh intensity. The day might come when he'd need to defend himself and the dragon from more than just curious onlookers. Meanwhile, certain factions within Volantis began to take note. One evening, a small group of sellswords approached the temple gates, requesting an audience about rumored monsters. The priests turned them away, but word spread that a living dragon resided within. Some mocked the rumors as tall tales. Others saw them as an opportunity for profit. The temple's protectors stationed more guards at every entrance, red-robed acolytes armed with spears and crossbows. Jon felt a creeping sense of unease. He was grateful for the temple's sanctuary, but he knew it could not last forever. If the world discovered a Targaryen whelp with a growing dragon, factions from across Essos and Westeros would come seeking to control or destroy him. The high priest assured him that the power of R'hllor would shield them. But Jon was reminded of Ned Stark's words, "When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die." He had never sought such a game, but it would be forced upon him once the secret truly got out. In fleeting moments of clarity, Jon realized the unimaginable reality of a second Targaryen presence in the east, Daenerys, said to be with her own dragons. If her story was true, then perhaps she had a parallel destiny. The Red Temple, for its part, had an uneasy stance on Daenerys. Some priests believed she might be Azor Ahai reborn. Others pointed to Jon and his wolfish heritage as a sign of prophecy merging fire and ice. R'hllor insisted the temple remain neutral on such interpretations, focusing on nurturing Jon's bond with Shadowfire. Occasionally, Torum brought Jon letters smuggled from Westeros. Once, He received word that Eddard Stark had been declared a traitor in King's Landing. That conflict loomed. Jon's heart sank. The letter was vague, but it hinted at chaos in the capital. Another letter claimed that Robb Stark had called his banners, that the North was at war with the Lannisters. His siblings might be in peril, living in a kingdom torn by strife. Yet here he was, half a world away, forging a new identity. Guilt gnawed at him. Could he simply remain in Volantis, safe behind temple walls, while his family bled? Shadowfire's presence changed that guilt into determination. He could not abandon his siblings, but neither could he ride into a war with a dragon too small to turn the tide. If he returned too soon, the creature might be cut down by a well-placed arrow or a cunning sabotage. So he trained, he waited, he planned. The day would come when Shadowfire's wings would stretch wide enough to cross seas and burn armies. On that day, perhaps he could intervene decisively in the wars to come, or in the greater battle that might loom beyond the wall. Until then, he would obey the quiet counsel of patience. Each evening, after prayers in the temple, Jon would walk the corridors with Ghost padding at his side. He'd pass the chanting priests, the flickering torches, and find solace in the courtyard where Shadowfire slept, curled in a nest of warm coals. The dragon would blink awake, smoky breath curling from its nostrils, and greet Jon with a low rumble. Jon would stroke the scales of its neck, feeling the living heat pulsing beneath. Sometimes he whispered old Stark prayers to the old gods, sometimes Targaryen words he barely understood. The dragon listened, a silent witness to the confluence of two great houses, two ancient powers, ice and fire. Months blurred into a routine. Train, study, care for Shadowfire, avoid too much public attention, and glean tidings from Westeros. Jon's high Valyrian improved, and he felt more confident with a blade. The priests tested him with small illusions of flame, pushing him to interpret the images dancing in the fire. He saw glimpses, ghostly shapes of dire wolves and dragons locked in battle with figures of ice. He saw a shadow crown falling from a tower of swords. He saw a woman with silver gold hair standing amidst a field of ashes. He didn't understand the full meanings, but each vision left him shaken. Prophecy was a perilous maze, prone to misinterpretation. As Shadowfire neared the size of a small horse, the Red Temple's chambers began to feel confining. The dragon's roars echoed ominously at night, causing complaints from the city's inhabitants. More priests murmured about potential danger, about the temple's secrecy being compromised. High Priest Rallio finally decreed that Shadowfire should be moved outside the city's main confines to a secluded compound the temple controlled on the outskirts of Volantis. Torum prepared the way, ensuring the walls were reinforced and the area secure. So Jon found himself riding a wagon alongside Shadowfire, who growled at the harness but tolerated it. They traveled at dawn, hoping fewer onlookers would be out. Still, a handful of curious stares and gasps followed them along the streets. Whispers spread like wildfire. A black dragon in Volantis. Some even followed at a distance, as though uncertain whether they dared approach. Once at the compound, a stretch of land surrounded by high walls and dotted with small structures, Shadowfire was released to roam in an open courtyard. There, with plenty of space, the dragon could stretch its wings and attempt longer flights. Jon looked up at the sky, imagining the day Shadowfire would be strong enough to carry him aloft. The priests claimed that, with proper feeding and time, the dragon would grow to match the beasts of old. But it was still young and growth took years. Every day, Shadowfire tested the air, flapping its wings in short bursts, gliding from one end of the courtyard to the other. Jon would watch with pride, heart hammering in excitement at the potential. Ghost would prowl around the perimeter, occasionally howling if the dragon got too close. Torum introduced more advanced training exercises, commanding Shadowfire to unleash fire on designated targets, controlling the dragon's impulses, ensuring it recognized Jon's authority. It was not easy. Dragons were not mere beasts. They possessed a fierce intelligence and an inborn arrogance. More than once, Shadowfire roared defiantly and refused to obey. Jon learned to match that roar with his own firm tone, forging a relationship built on mutual respect rather than blind submission. Over time, a deep understanding blossomed. When the dragon soared overhead, even if briefly, Jon felt a sense of exultation unlike anything else. Word of a dragon beyond the city walls could not be contained indefinitely. Adventurers, opportunists, and envoys from other factions arrived, seeking audience. Torum and the temple guards turned most away, citing private worship matters. But trouble brewed. One day, a band of armed men approached the compound gates, led by a wealthy merchant who declared he wished to purchase the dragon for an astronomical sum. Torum refused them. Tensions flared, swords were drawn, and a short but bloody skirmish erupted. The Red Temple guards prevailed, but not without injury. Jon realized then how precarious their situation was. Shadowfire was a treasure beyond measure, and many would kill to claim that power. High Priest Rallio began speaking of relocating entirely, taking the dragon and Jon deeper into Essos, perhaps to a fortress in the Red Waste where few dared venture. But Torum argued that Volantis was the seat of the Red Temple's power, that leaving would only embolden others to try to capture the dragon. Jon felt torn. Moving further east might keep them safer from immediate threats, but it would carry him even further from Westeros, from the Wall, from the oncoming winter. Amidst these debates, a raven arrived, one of the rare communications from Westeros. It brought staggering news. King Robert Baratheon was dead, and a war of kings had erupted. Renly and Stannis both claimed the throne, Joffrey Baratheon sat in King's Landing, and Robb Stark had been crowned king in the north. The realm was fractured. Jon's heart clenched at the thought of Robb as a king, leading northern armies. Where did that leave him? A Targaryen, hidden across the sea, shaping a dragon's destiny. He had no illusions that his half-brother would welcome a secret Targaryen with open arms, but the memory of their boyhood camaraderie stung all the same. With Robert gone, the danger from House Baratheon might shift. Stannis was rumored to have a red priestess in his service. Could he be an ally of R'hllor? Or was he a zealot who might see Jon as a rival? The entire political landscape had changed, but it still spelled danger. If Tywin Lannister or Joffrey learned of a Targaryen bastard with a living dragon, the Lannister gold would pay for armies or assassins to hunt him down. Faced with these complications, the temple leadership concluded it was time to accelerate Jon's training and press him to make a choice. Either he would remain a guardian of the faith in Volantis, forging an alliance that might one day reshape the political order of Westeros, or he would journey back when the time was right, seeking to unite the realm against the Winter Menace. Rallio believed the second path was the truer prophecy, that the real battle lay in the north, not the squabbles of southern kings. Jon listened, torn by conflicting loyalties. His adoptive family, the realm's need, and the warm acceptance he'd found here. Yet Shadowfire's presence in his life had made one thing clear. He was no ordinary bastard. He was tethered to forces greater than himself, and sooner or later, he would have to face them. Each time he looked at the dragon's fiery eyes, he saw the reflection of his own uncertain fate. Ice and fire, wolf and dragon. The north called, and the flame beckoned. For the time being, he stayed in Volantis, nurturing the power that might one day protect the people he loved. But deep in his heart, he knew his journey was just beginning, that one day he would cross the sea again. Not as Jon Snow the bastard, but as someone else entirely. Someone shaped by both the wolf's loyalty and the dragon's fire, carrying within him the hopes of a world on the brink of an icy doom. And so, in the land of ancient temples and endless flames, Jon Snow, unknown son of Rhaegar Targaryen, bided his time, bound to the young dragon that had hatched by his hand. The Red Temple circled around him, seeing in him the promise of a new dawn, even as the shadows of war loomed across the ocean. Winter was coming, and he would be ready. One day, he would return to Westeros with Shadowfire at his side, prepared to face the darkness that lurked beyond the wall, and the strife tearing the Seven Kingdoms apart. For now, the embers of prophecy smoldered in Volantis, where a boy once called Snow embraced the truth of his birth and the power of flame, guided by the quiet conviction that when the hour was darkest, the dragon's roar would light the way.